My toxic mother and manipulative stepsister ruined my childhood. At 17, I was framed and kicked out of my home, but my best friend's family gave me a chance at a new life. Now, my stepsister is trying to destroy my success from a business conflict to a legal battle. I was 26, and for the past 2 months, I had been engaged to my fiancé, Jason, who was also 26. We met 4 years ago on a dating app, and from that moment on, we were inseparable. Jason was my soulmate, the only person in my life who had never let me down. My life hadn't been easy. My parents divorced when I was 2 years old. My father walked out of our lives and we never spoke again. Sure, he paid child support, but that was it. No attempts to see me, no effort to know how I was doing. My mother, Helen, was 48 now, but honestly, she hadn't been much of a mother to me growing up. She was more preoccupied with her own life than raising me. I was mostly raised by nannies and babysitters. As I got older, it became clear that my mother had me at a young age, and her priorities had always been elsewhere. She didn't care much about Mesh, spent her time with friends, going on dates, living her socialite life. Even her job as a freelance artist was something she never took too seriously. She made decent money, but child support helped her provide for me. It pains me to say this, but I'm almost certain that if it weren't for that money, she would have kicked me out a long time ago. She never had any real attachment to me. Most of the time, I felt like she was just waiting for me to grow up and leave so she could finally have her life to herself. When I was around 13, she started dating a man named Mark. He was 50 and had a daughter my egglets call her Jessica. When my mother first introduced them to me, she asked me to behave perfectly, saying it was very important to her. That was odd. My mother had brought home plenty of men before, probably dozens, maybe even hundreds, but she never cared how I acted. Usually, she'd just tell me someone was coming over, and I knew that meant I should disappear into my room until they were gone. But this time was different. This time, she actually wanted me to be present, to make a good impression. That alone told me that she was serious about this man. Otherwise, she wouldn't have cared. When I first met Mark and Jessica, they were polite, and the meeting went well enough. I had no idea what was coming next. Mark started showing up more and more until it felt like they practically lived with us. At first, I didn't mind. As long as I was left alone, I didn't care what my mother did. Jessica wasn't always around since she still spent half the month with her own mother. At first, Mark and Jessica either treated me nicely or ignored me altogether, and I was fine with that. I didn't care about them either. All I wanted was peace and quiet, and for a while I had that. But then, they made the move permanent. I wouldn't have cared about that either. Except my mother told me that, since they were officially moving in, I'd have to share my bedroom with Jessica. That was my breaking point. I flat out refused. That room had been mine my entire life. It was the one place in the house where I felt safe, where I could be alone. I wasn't about to sacrifice my space for someone I barely knew. When I told my mother I wasn't going to do it, we had the worst fight we'd ever had. She screamed at me, threatened to throw me out of the house if I didn't comply. I was only 14, but I wasn't stupid. I knew the law. And more importantly, I knew my mother well enough to know she couldn't be trusted. So I did my research. Common sense told me she legally couldn't kick me out until I turned 18, and if she tried, she'd have a whole lot of legal trouble to deal with. I called her bluff. She was furious, but she had no choice but to back down. Instead, she decided to turn the basement into Jessica's room. It wasn't a bad space. She actually put an effort to make it nice, cozy even. When it was finished, it looked just as good as any other bedroom in the house. So, I didn't understand why it was such a big deal. But apparently, my mother wanted to make sure it was a big deal. On the day Jessica moved in, my mother gave everyone a full house tour and made a point to mention that Jessica had to live in the basement because I refused to share my room. She said it so dramatically, like I had done something awful, like I had banished Jessica underground. I had no idea why she did that. Maybe she wanted to make me feel guilty. Maybe she just loved stirring up drama. Either way, all she accomplished was making me feel secondhand embarrassment. I wasn't ashamed of standing my ground, but I was ashamed of how pathetic my mother was acting. And of course, it worked. Jessica hated me from that moment on. She couldn't let it go. For half the month, she was still with her mom, but the days she spent with us turned into hell. Jessica was a menace to society, and for some reason, she had decided to make me her personal target. She was cruel, straight to my face, without hesitation. Just to give you an idea, one time, she looked me dead in the eye and said my father had abandoned my mother because of me. Then she laughed, like it was the funniest joke in the world. She constantly mocked my appearance. I was a little chubby back then, and she never let me forget it. But she didn't need a reason, she just enjoyed making me miserable. At school, Jessica had her own little clique of mean girls, and they took every opportunity to humiliate me. Before all this, she and her friends had mostly ignored me, and honestly, that was fine. We were never friends, but being ignored was a hell of a lot better than being her enemy. The saddest part? I never did anything to her. The only reason she decided to ruin my life was because I didn't want to share my bedroom. That was it. That was enough for her to start making my life a nightmare. That room was my safe space. With a mother like mine, anyone would understand why I needed some part of my life to be mine alone. And honestly, if Jessica had made any effort to get to know me, maybe things would have been different. Maybe I would have let her in. But she was a stranger to me, and I wasn't about to sacrifice my only bit of freedom for someone I didn't trust. I never complained to my mother or Mark about Jessica's behavior. There was no point. They knew what she was doing, and they didn't care. They could have watched me get bullied every single day and still would have turned a blind eye because, to them, I wasn't worth defending. I meant nothing to them. So, I endured it. I let Jessica trample all over me. Sometimes I fought back, but I quickly learned that only made things worse. That's when our parents would get involved, and I would always be the one in trouble. Jessica had this ability to cry on cue, make herself the victim in any situation, and dodge every consequence. I, on the other hand, wasn't some manipulative mastermind I couldn't turn on the waterworks in fake innocence. So, I always took the blame. Every time, I was told I needed to start treating Jessica like a sister. Meanwhile, she got away with everything. It was unbearable. I hated my life. So when my 18th birthday got close and they finally kicked me out, I didn't even feel hurt. If anything, I felt relief. I had spent years surviving in that madhouse, and it had only gotten worse over time. Jessica never let up, and our parents never stopped enabling her. By the time high school ended, she had turned almost our entire class against me. I had maybe 2 friends left, everyone else hated me simply because Jessica did. And that was enough. It destroyed me. I was a wreck. My mental health had hit rock bottom, and I was barely functioning. I ate to cope with the stress, which only made me gain more weight. My skin broke out, my hair looked awful, and my grades were slipping. I didn't just feel terrible, I looked terrible too. I was spiraling, and there was nothing good in my life to hold on to. Home wasn't any better. Jessica was still there. My mother was still there. Mark was still there. And at some point, my mother stopped just ignoring Mesh, actively made sure I felt worthless. Before she married Mark, she hadn't really cared about me. But now she constantly compared me to Jessica, even though she knew exactly how Jessica treated me. Before, things had been bad. But after the marriage, things became unbearable. It was clear as day. Jessica was the daughter my mother had always wanted. But life had other plans, and instead, she got me. She hated it. They both did. And honestly, I wished I wasn't there either. Jessica and my mother despised me, and Mark didn't give a damn. I had no family outside of them. My grandparents had cut contact years ago, and I had never met my father's side of the family. I had nowhere to go, and as much as I hated it, I had no choice but to stay. I needed a roof over my head. I needed food. I just had to survive until I turned 18. But I never made it that far. A few weeks before my birthday, something happened. Something that got me kicked out on the spot. It was a weekend. And I still remember that day like it happened yesterday. Because that day was, without a doubt, one of the most traumatic, stressful days of my life. At that point, Jessica and I had just graduated. She had a friend whose older brother was in college, and Jessica had been dating him for a while. Because of that, she and her little posse had started hanging out with his crowd people older than us, guys who were way past high school drama. I knew what they were getting up to. But I never said anything to our parents, because, knowing my luck, it would have only come back to bite me. That's why I never told anyone about Jessica's little habits. I had never been into that kind of thing anyway. For one, I didn't have the kind of cool friends who could get their hands on alcohol, cigarettes, or anything worse. And two, I was already struggling with my weight, my grades, my mental health. The last thing I needed was to add another problem to my life. But that day, I made a mistake. I forgot to lock my bedroom door before getting in the shower. The next thing I knew, there was furious banging on the bathroom door, and my mother was screaming at me to get out immediately. I rushed to throw on some clothes and stepped out, confused and still dripping wet, only to find my mother, Mark, and Jessica waiting for me in my bedroom with serious looks on their faces. Then my mother pulled something from under my bed. A pile of empty beer bottles, and worsey massive bag of something far more illegal. I froze. I knew it wasn't mine. Jessica knew it wasn't mine. But my parents? They didn't care about what was true. Somehow, Jessica had managed to sneak it into my room while I was gone, and then tipped my mother off. They all started screaming at me, calling me a disgrace, a disappointment. My mother went off about how I was pathetic, how I was just a useless leech, eating her food, taking up her space, living off her money. She ranted about how I would never amount to anything, how I would just rot in her house forever, draining her finances. I tried over and over to explain that it wasn't mine, that I had no idea how it had even gotten there. She didn't believe me. She refused to believe me. But when I dared to suggest that Jessica had set me up, that's when my mother completely lost it. She screamed that I had always been jealous of Jessica, that I would never be as good as her, and that was why I was trying to pin the blame on her. I was crying, sobbing actually, but she didn't care. She just kept yelling. And then, out of nowhere, she went silent, and she told me to get out. At first, I didn't understand what she meant, so I asked her, "Where am I supposed to go?" She just shrugged, said she didn't care. She was done with me. I told her I wasn't going anywhere. I had nowhere to go. That's when she threatened to call the cops. And, since I was only weeks away from turning 18, she made sure I understood if the police found drugs in my room, they would take it seriously. She said she didn't want me in her house anymore, wasting her money. That from now on, I had to take care of myself because she wasn't going to pretend to be a mother to someone who didn't deserve it. I begged her. I didn't want to stay, but I knew I had no other option. I had no money, no backup plan, nothing. But she didn't care. She said if I wasn't gone by tonight, she would call the police. I was stunned by how heartless she was. But what really got me, neither Mark nor Jessica said a word. They just went about their business, like nothing was happening. Like my entire world wasn't crumbling right in front of them. After crying and begging for hours, I realized there was no way out of this. I had no choice. Between getting arrested for something I didn't do and ending up on the streets, I chose the streets. I packed up my things as quickly as I could. By the time I was done, it was evening. And when I left the house, no one even looked at me. No goodbyes. No second thoughts. And I didn't look back either. I spent the next few hours sitting on a park bench, trying to figure out what the hell I was going to do. But then, it started getting cold. I knew I couldn't stay there all night. So I did the only thing I could think of. I went to my best friend's house, Amy. I knocked on her door and asked if I could stay with her for a few days. She already knew how my parents treated me, so I didn't have to explain much. But when I told her exactly what had happened that day, she was horrified. Amy told me that her parents would help me if I let them. I had always begged her not to tell anyone how bad things were at home, not even her family. I was afraid people wouldn't believe me. I was embarrassed. But that night, she insisted. She made me tell them everything, and when I did, they were furious. They even called my mother, trying to reason with her. But that went nowhere. My mother was just as cruel to them as she was to me. They realized that talking wouldn't fix anything. So instead, they did something that I will always be grateful for. They told me I could stay with them for as long as I needed. They weren't struggling financially, so money wasn't an issue for them. And Amy? She loved me. She was more than happy to share her room. I ended up living with them for the next few years. I got into a local college and not a great one, since my grades were terrible. But it was something. I got a job, started saving money, and Amy's parents made sure I never felt pressured to leave before I was ready. They did everything to make sure I was safe and comfortable. About 3 years ago, I finally saved up enough to move out on my own. I was proud of myself, but more than anything, I was grateful. Because without Amy and her family, I don't know where I'd be. Even on the day I moved into my new place, Amy's parents helped me get settled. They told me I would always have a place with them, whether just for a visit or, if I ever needed, a home to return to. That moment changed everything for me. By then, I had lost a significant amount of weight. My health had improved, and for the first time in my life, I actually felt good about myself. I was earning enough to support myself, and after putting so much effort into rebuilding my confidence, I decided it was time to start dating. I wanted to get married someday, and I knew I had to start looking for someone serious. Before meeting Jason, I had gone on a few dates, but none of them ever led to anything. It always fizzled out before it even began. But when I met Jason, I finally understood why. Because he was the one I had been waiting for. Every other guy had just been a passing moment, but with Jason, it was different from the very start. When we first started dating, I had no idea he came from money. I didn't know his family owned a chain of restaurants or that he would eventually inherit them. I liked him because he was funny, charming, and most importantly, genuine. A few months into our relationship, he finally told me about his family business. And honestly, it changed nothing for me. I still saw him as the same person I had fallen for. A year into our relationship, we moved in together. A few months before that, he introduced me to his family, and to my surprise, they loved me. We got along effortlessly. Everything felt perfect. And recently, when Jason got down on one knee and asked me to marry him, I didn't even hesitate. I said yes. We've been engaged for 2 months now, and everything has been amazing, until 2 weeks ago. That's when I got a letter from Jessica. We hadn't spoken in almost 8 years. Since the day I was kicked out, I hadn't heard a word from my family. I had no idea why. After all this time, she suddenly wanted to reach out. We had both moved on. Neither of us had any reason to fix something that was long past repair. But then, I read the letter, and I understood exactly why she had written it. Jessica wanted to apologize. She admitted everything, that she had planted those things in my room to get me kicked out, that she had hated me for no real reason. I couldn't believe it. Why now? Why confess after all these years? And then it hit me. The timing was too convenient. She must have found out about my engagement. I had posted about it on social media, and since we went to the same high school, someone must have told her. Something about all of this felt off. So, I decided to look into it. It didn't take me long to find out that Jessica's husband owned a company that supplied plastic containers and other packaging for takeout orders to the same restaurant chain owned by Jason's family. It was easy to figure out. All I had to do was create a fake profile and dig through her pictures. From there, I found her husband's profile, where he proudly listed his job in his bio. I already knew a lot about Jason's family business since we had been preparing to run it together when his father retired. So when I realized that Jessica's husband was the supplier for their restaurants, I immediately told Jason. For years, I had avoided thinking about my past. I hadn't followed any of my family members on social media. I had asked my friends not to update me on their lives. So I had no idea Jessica had been married for a while. But when I realized that her husband was in business with Jason's family, that was it. Jason and I made the decision to cut him off. Not just because of Jessica, but because, honestly, the supplies were overpriced and the quality had gone downhill over the years. Jason's family had already been considering switching to a new supplier. They were in negotiations with another company that offered better products at lower prices. So last week, just a few days after I received Jessica's letter, Jason set up a meeting with her husband and terminated the contract. Jessica must have found out, because suddenly she was posting all over social media blaming me. After almost a decade of silence, she still believed I was holding a grudge against her. And the truth? I did resent her. But that wasn't why her husband lost the contract. It wasn't personal. It was business. But a few days ago, Jessica posted something that made me realize just how bad things were on her end. She mentioned that they had already been losing clients one after another. And this contract? It had been the final nail in the coffin. But of course, Jessica insisted that I had done this purely out of revenge. She called it an unprofessional and spiteful move on our part. She even tagged the restaurant's official Facebook page in her post. And just like that, the situation exploded. In her rant, she claimed that losing this contract was devastating to their business, that their company was already struggling, and now they were hemorrhaging clients. And while, yes, I won't pretend there wasn't a personal element to this decision, the majority of it was purely business. I don't believe for a second that Jason or his father would have terminated the contract just because of me. That being said, I did feel a little bad for her husband. Update number 1. Jason spoke with his father's legal team, and they assured us we were completely in the right. So now, we're taking legal action. We're demanding that Jessica and her husband remove the post immediately, and we're also filing a defamation lawsuit. At the end of the day, their company was overcharging for low-quality products. If we found a better supplier, then obviously, we were going to switch. The fact that Jessica happened to be married to the owner of that company, that was just a coincidence. Instead of focusing on fixing their business, Jessica decided to publicly drag us through the mud. It's actually hilarious that I even let myself feel bad for her after everything she put me through. Update number 2. Jason and his father officially filed the lawsuit against Jessica and her husband a few days ago. We have a court-appointed mediator meeting next week. Meanwhile, my mother has, of course, decided to rush to Jessica's defense her poor, innocent little stepdaughter. It's almost comical. It feels like high school all over again. Except this time, I can completely ignore them, and I will. Update number 3. We won the defamation case. Turns out, it wasn't even hard. Jason's father's lawyers are ruthless, and they absolutely shredded Jessica and her husband in court. In the end, they were forced to pay damages for their false accusations. Now, it's over, and Jason and I can finally shift our focus back to planning our wedding. I can't wait to marry the man of my dreams. Thank you for your attention. Subscribe, leave a like, and have a great day.